I want to continue a conversation with you that we started on Monday and continued yesterday to some degree, which seems to be interesting and useful to a lot of people. And I think it's a pretty necessary conversation. And it all sort of relates to the horrific mass shooting at that gay club in Orlando, Florida called Pulse over the weekend that left nearly 50 dead and about another 50 injured. On Monday, I made very clear that there is not one solution to these mass shootings that involve ready access to guns, mental instability of different kinds, religious radicalization, etc. It's not guns alone. It isn't mental health alone. It isn't Islamic extremism alone. Yesterday, we went further and said it's also not just one motivation that causes these incidents. It's not just about religion as a catalyst. It isn't just about anger or mental instability or mental illness that is the catalyst here. And today, what I want to delve further into is that way too many of the suggestions for fixing the problem that we hear from people every time there's one of these incidents really won't do that. Most are politically motivated suggestions, solutions, based on the particular political biases of the person suggesting it. So let's just go through a few, and you'll see that some are more common to people on the left, and some are more common to people on the right, and all of them really ignore the reality that these alone are not solutions. So, for example, expanded background checks absolutely must happen. Logical as a general issue around gun safety, but it wouldn't have stopped the Orlando shooting. The Orlando shooter was not legally barred from having guns. Definitely, waiting periods should be extended to try to allow some people to cool off. Definitely, everybody who buys a gun, no matter where or what the circumstances, should be subject to a background check. The more extensive, the better. But it wouldn't solve these particular situations in many cases. Now, that's okay. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do that. I think often, Lewis, people will point to any proposed solution and say, it wouldn't have physically prevented this incident, thus it's not worth anything. That's also fallacious thinking. But we have to remember, when these are proposed as these standalone solutions, that also doesn't make sense.
No, this is a big one, though. It's common sense. And if it stops even one incident from happening, then it worked, and it is not going to stop any law-abiding citizen from getting their guns.
Now, the other argument around the guns is you shouldn't be able to get a gun if you're on the terror watch list. That's absolutely logical. We absolutely must do that. But aside from the argument that we hear from the pro-gun right that people can still get guns illegally, this individual shooter, Omar Mateen's investigation by the FBI was closed. Thus, he wouldn't have been on the terror watch list anyway. So yes, we should have a system that prevents people on the terror watch list from getting guns. In this particular case, would not have made a difference. Banning assault weapons. Absolutely, we should be banning guns that have no purpose in civilian life or hunting. AR-15 type rifles have now been used numerous times in these shootings, but this would merely reduce the number of people who can be killed. A worthy cause. If we can't prevent these shootings, but we can minimize the number of people who die at each shooting, that is still a good thing, but it doesn't get at the root of the problem. For those who say, well, you need AR-15 type rifles in case the government gets tyrannical, if you think an AR-15 is going to help you overthrow the government, you probably have bigger delusions to deal with, don't you?
It just isn't going to come to that. And if the government wants to take your guns, they are probably going to end up doing so successfully, regardless of what type of arsenal you have. And there's just not going to be some war between the United States citizens and their government. Yes, let's make sure people don't have weapons designed strictly to kill as many people as possible.
Now, the pro-gun right will say, well, we need to be arming everybody and getting rid of gun-free zones. That's very popular among the NRA and gun fetishist types. And I want to remind you, there were 3 off-duty officers on site at Pulse nightclub. This still happened. Even trained armed officers were not a significant deterrent nor solution to taking down an active shooter. Is the argument that there weren't enough and you need even more armed security en masse everywhere? Just fill public spaces with armed guards? Isn't that the police state that many use as a justification to get guns in the first place? That's not a logical solution either.
No. More guns, not the answer. More police, probably not the answer. but one of the solutions would be just better training. I think. I mean, certainly that will help when something actually starts going down, right?
The obsession with guns and culture is also a problem. Undeniable statistics that those who own guns are more likely overall than those who don't to become victims of gun crime. Is that because they have the guns and that puts them at greater risk? Or is it just a self selection bias where people who legitimately are more at risk are more likely to want guns? Well, that's a bit of a complex issue, but there is no doubt that this obsession, this testosterone coded gun culture, as a viewer named Andy pointed out on the Monday show, is a problem here. And then I want to talk about mental health. It's well documented. It's undeniable that an overwhelming portion of mass shooters suffered from some combination of depression, significant anxiety, schizophrenia, etc. There's huge stigma with these conditions and improper treatment, but it isn't that alone. And it's also really difficult to identify all of the people that are at risk. I mean, should we be doing basic mental health checks in school? Have you been sad? Have you thought of killing yourself? Do you look forward to anything? Do you think people are telling you things and then you wonder if there really was someone saying anything to you? But this is a tricky balance because even though you can make a case for earlier screening for mental illness, the overwhelming majority of people with those conditions will never be violent, right? That's a misconception that it's very common that people with depression or anxiety or schizophrenia are violent. Typically, they are not. The overwhelming majority are not. So are you going to be further stigmatizing those conditions by instituting some kind of check starting in school level? I don't know. And then the last thing I want to mention, and President Obama mentioned this in his recent statement about the shooting, we need to support research of the gun issue as a public health issue. At this time, Congress doesn't permit government organizations to study shootings as a public health issue. There's no good reason to prevent them from doing these studies, but there's this sort of NRA gun fetishist knee-jerk reaction that any attempt to study gun violence can never be anything but a pretext to take guns away. And that is a huge impediment to progress here. So, Lewis, there is no one solution. What we do know is many of these so-called solutions that are proposed are often motivated just by the personal political biases of the persons or organizations suggesting them.
Well, what's funny about it to me is that that's kind of like American politics. No matter what the problem is, someone thinks that they have one very simple idea that will fix everything, right? Oh, there's income inequality. Here's my plan. Flat tax, right? Gonna fix everything. Well, maybe it's not that simple.
No doubt about it. And the corporate media narratives around these issues are truly disastrous. You will rarely, not that it doesn't exist, but you will rarely see really well-rounded discussions around the causes of and solutions to this huge extremist gun violence problem that we have in the United States. And as I mentioned yesterday, you see guests coming on, the psychologist says it's just mental illness, the NRA guy says it's not enough guns, whatever. And we're not going to get anywhere with that type of thinking.